Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family, Lynn and Joyce. Thank you both so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue with more from a book that proved surprisingly popular last year, The Handbook on Cheese Making by George E. Newell. First published in 1889 by the Michigan Dairyman, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Let's pick up right where we left off, in the middle of the manufacturing process. Let's begin. Hooping curd. On placing curd in the hoop, measure it all in a pail, and then you will get the cheese of nearly an exact weight. When spreading on the cap cloth, wring it out of warm water, that last thing stirring up the surface curd from below so that there will be warmth to form a good rind. Apply the pressure slowly at first, and as soon as the whey starts from the hoops with a gush, desist and let them rest for a few moments. The reason for this is to retain the salt and not expel it with the whey by an injudicious display of strength. You have perhaps considered 2 pounds or 2.5 of salt per 1,000 pounds of milk, just right for the curd and the season of the year, and it would be most unwise and foolish to let it dribble away to the detriment of the product. As soon as the whey ceases to start freely, come down snugly on them with the lever, and then turn your attention to washing up the vat and utensils. Cleaning tin utensils. This part of a maker's duties has an important bearing on cheese manufacture, for if he is a sloven, it does but little good for patrons to strive to furnish him with pure sweet milk. Wash the vat and utensils through 2 waters, and scald with that which is boiling. The vat and all utensils should be scoured at least once a week with salt to prevent the propagation of a yellow and white fungus growth that is a persistent parasite of factories. Milk strainers should be hung out where the bright sunshine can reach them, and all the windows and outside doors to the make room should be opened to drive out the dampness that has accumulated during the forepart of the day. Pulling up the bandage cloth. In from 15 to 20 minutes after hooping curd, turn your attention to them again. If the old-style hoops are used, you will be obliged to bandage them by hand. If not, to pull up the bandage cloth. As the former way is nearly obsolete, we will simply discuss the modus operandi of the latter. Set a pailful of clean, warm water near you, and as you remove the cap cloths, rinse them vigorously in this to wash out all sour whey. Pull the margin of the bandage up and turn it neatly over the edge of the cheese. Then, wringing the cap slightly to remove only the surplus water, spread it over the surface. Apply now all the power that you have, that is, reasonable power. You do not want to press so hard that the butter will be crushed out of the cheese structure, but you want to press so as to expel all whey and permanently solidify the cheese. I examined 1888 made cheese this spring that were of fine quality but insufficiently pressed. The seams and cracks were moldy and damp with whey, which damaged an otherwise fancy product 50%. Cleaning up. Cleaning up is the last duty of the cheesemaker for the day. I use hot water freely on any portion of the floor with which whey has come in contact, and especially should it be used about the spouts and drains, for it is here that filth lurks and easily conceals itself. Boiling water will search it out and eradicate it. Dash it on copiously all around. Sal soda and potash are helpful aids to keep the make-room sweet, and a liberal supply should be counted among the necessities of every factory. The curing room. It is just as easy to have a model curing room as one that is defective in structure. A cheese may be turned out of the hoop, the acme of perfection in every detail of manufacture, and yet subsequently be damaged partly or wholly ruined by inhabiting a faulty curing apartment. The curing room should not be in a loft or above the make room. It should be on the ground floor, and for convenience it should open direct from the make room, the door being easy of access to the press. The partition between the two rooms must be impervious to the steam arising from the cheese vats, as the animal vapor is detrimental to the maturing product on the shelves. The room should by all means be plastered, and have windows that can be lowered from the top when necessary for proper ventilation. In these times when cheese are frequently shipped, when only 10 days from the hoop, a large curing room is not necessary, even for a large factory. The smaller you can have it without crowding, the better. If you want a room that will hold 300 cheese, lay shelves 2 1/2 feet above the floor that will accommodate 100. Put in stout uprights 7 1/2 feet high, and on cross pieces above, lay 2 more tiers of shelves of the same surface capacity as the bottom counter. When it is finished, you have 3 tiers of shelves encircling the room, save for 2 doors, with space left in the center for a box stove. The object of arranging shelves one above another is not so much to utilize space as it is to scientifically cure the product. It, however, answers for both purposes. In a room, temperature rises with height, and the atmosphere is, of course, several degrees warmer near the ceiling than in the region of the floor. Hang a reliable thermometer on a range with the second tier of shelves in a portion of the room where it will not be affected by direct heat from the stove. In this position, the mercury should range from 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature on the top shelf at the same time rising to the vicinity of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. We will be supposed to carry a day's make of cheese into such a room when it is empty. Place them all on the top shelf in regular order, 2 deep. Continue to add from day to day until the top shelf is completely filled all around. Then begin at the end where you first started and take down the first day's make and place on the second shelf, arranging those fresh from the hoop in their place. Continue this process all around until the second tier is filled. Your next move will necessitate 2 removals, leaving the oldest on the bottom tier and the greenest on the top. As soon as a cheese leaves the hoop, a certain warmth of atmosphere is necessary to assist the process of fermentation that should at once begin. If this warmth is lacking, green cheese will sour on the shelves before they can cure. Therefore, always place them in the most favorable position for assistance in the direction of maturity that you have at command. Care of cheese. Take cheese from the hoops after they have been under pressure about 18 hours. If they have been properly made and thoroughly cooked, and the cap claws are sweet and clean, the latter will peel from the ends without making an abrasion of the rind. Allow them to stand an hour or so on the shelves before greasing. The surface moisture will then have evaporated, and the rinds will deepen to a golden color and become crisp and slightly rough under the touch. Heat whey butter as hot as you can bear your hand in it, and using a large piece of bandage cloth, no other cloth is as good, dip it in the hot grease and apply by a thorough rubbing into the cheese surface. The butter being hot will strike in and lend toughness and elasticity to the rind. Date the cheese after they have been on the shelves a day. The bandage cloth will then have become dry, and the dates can be made to show clear and distinct. Turn cheese over every day and rub them thoroughly with a sponge of bandage cloth well oiled. Dealers, retailers, and consumers insist on a good, perfect rind, and as makers, we must give it to them. Appearance sometimes goes farther than quality, but we want both, and want them united. Sometimes cheese will mold on the sides during damp, muggy weather in summer. It will not do to drive out the dampness with fire, so establish a free circulation of air through the room, and the mold will cease to accumulate. In a curing room, it is easier to keep temperature where you want it during cool than in hot weather. If the mercury gets to running up above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, sprinkle the floor vigorously with cold water. Take out the window sashes, and on the south side keep the blinds closed or shade down. Good cheese can endure a temperature of 80 degrees for a while without deteriorating, but such a heat is not desirable. Keep it below that if possible during a hot wave. The shelves on which the cheese rests should be of sound lumber, smoothly planed basswood or pine, and each board a little wider than the diameter of the cheese. Care should be taken to have the bandages the exact circumference of the inside of the hoop. If the band is contracted, the cloth will split open under pressure and expose the cheese to the attack of skipper flies. If too large, the cheese will expand on the shelf and make it difficult to be jammed into a box for shipment. The reason the curing room should not be over the make apartment or in a loft is that in the former, the vapor and odors generated below are not desirable curing factors, and in both cases excessive heat is unavoidable due to the elevation and the direct rays of the sun on the roof. When cheese gets so warmed up that the butter starts, the flavor is deteriorating also. While curing, cheese need ventilation. Drafts of air should be avoided, as thereby the surfaces are dried up and checked. Too much light is not desirable in a curing room. Shade should be used at the windows to regulate this. It is now customary to ship cheese as soon as they cease to be curdy, which occurs in from 10 to 15 days from the hoop. Experienced help. One great setback to good cheese making is inexperienced and careless labor. This is another cog in the wheel that has been retrograding the reputation of our goods during the last few years. A medical student cannot obtain a diploma authorizing him to take under his charge the welfare of the sick without 3 years' study, aided by ocular demonstrations of his especial science. Then he is expected not to have a dim idea of a patient's condition when diagnosing his case, but to know and understand all about it. No cheesemaker is fit for duty unless he can diagnose the condition of a vat of milk on a quick examination. The natural odor of pure milk has a peculiar animal smell whose nature can be acquired by careful olfactory tests indulged in as the student draws the fluid from the cow's teats. After an apprentice at the business can tell pure, sweet, untainted milk in any spot or place, he must learn to distinguish between that which is tainted and that which is verging on the sour. Tainted milk is radically different from sour milk, and infused in the product, they each tend toward utterly diverse results. To pass a correct judgment on milk quality is thus essential number 1 in a maker's practical knowledge. Requirement number 2 is to have a thorough understanding of the constituents and influence of all of the foreign ingredients that go into cheese. Rennet, the most potent auxiliary of the cheesemaker's craft, should never be handled or applied by ignorant hands. The amateur maker should gain a physiological insight into the lactic portion of animal anatomy, and have an intelligent comprehension of the active force of the peptic secretion. When such knowledge is acquired, he will see the importance of never countenancing any coagulating fluid that is not immaculately pure in extraction and free from any subsequent taint. He will also understand its nature enough to always make a judicious application of it to the milk designed for manufacture. Here the necessity of step number 1, joining hands with number 2, is apparent, for he cannot make a judicious application unless his olfactory sense is trained to perceive and gauge every variation of the milk quality. Necessity number 3 is in following the quality variation of milk into the cooking and maturing curd. It is a well-known fact with cheesemakers that no 2 vats of curd will scarcely ever work exactly alike in succession. If one is to know absolutely just what to do and what to leave undone at certain moments of assimilation and maturity in curd, he must have gained that knowledge not from books, but from continued practical experience. Here the necessity for previous learning arises. No pettifogger would be expected to argue legal points before the Supreme Court, because lack of advancement in the rudiments of his profession would make him as unfit for such a pleader as a farmer or merchant. Every man to his business, and no man to be trusted in any trade capacity until he has proved himself competent. So, if an amateur lawyer or doctor is not to be trusted, why should responsibility be placed on the shoulders of a green hand at cheese-making? He is expected to properly prepare an important article of human food, and inexperienced and ignorant of the rudiments of his trade, he stumbles along in the dark, doing perhaps the best that he can, and not so much to blame for the failures that accrue as are his employers. Wide dispersion of training schools for both butter and cheese makers is not far off, and I, for one, hail that day with delight. Where our cheese goes to. After contemplating the immensity of our annual cheese output, the question naturally arises, where does it all go to? The earliest shipments of American cheese were made from New York to England in 1835 and 1836. The beginning was very limited. Shipments of cheese were made in casks. $60,000 would probably comprise the value of all shipments made in those years. As England still remains our principal foreign customer, we will come down to the year 1882 and give the official figures of the Port of New York of the annual receipts and exports. We do not mean to intimate that England takes all of our exports, but she absorbs the major portion of them. Receipts of cheese in New York. 1882. Receipts, 2,350,559. Exports, 1,898,192. 1883. Receipts, 2,456,232. Exports, 1,957,967. 1884. Receipts, 2,407,550. Exports, 1,932,702. 1885. Receipts, 2,122,187. Exports, 1,658,696. 1886. Receipts, 1,943,260. Exports, 1,575,262. 1887. Receipts, 1,994,857. Exports, 1,450,955. 1888. Receipts, 1,993,462. The 1888 export is not recorded yet. It is hard to get at the home trade quantity used throughout the country. There are many cheese distributed from factories to neighboring towns in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, and other states of which no account is kept, and there are no statistics covering the entire make, but at a guess we should say it was about 4 million boxes annually. The cause of decline in receipts at the Port of New York since 1882 is largely due to the fact that a good many cheese made in the northern part of this state, New York, are bought by Canadians and shipped via Montreal. It is said that Englishmen eat 12 pounds of cheese per capita a year, while Americans eat 3 pounds. Cheese consumption is, however, on the increase here, as the healthy and nutritive qualities of the product are more and more appreciated. One of the most serious drawbacks to universal cheese consumption is the large profits exacted by middlemen when they dispense it to the public. If cheese could be had at the grocery for 9 or 10 cents per pound instead of 14 or 15 cents, it would be found in abundance on the poor man's table, and a heavy decrease in the export trade would result. We believe that such a time is coming, and with it will come a vast improvement in the average quality of the national make. This is not a mere speculation, but a distinctive pointer of the times, and its verification is already at hand. 35 years ago, the innovation of the cheddar process gave cheese quality its first great advance. That advance remains yet to be perfected in detail, and then a cheese millennium will reign. Moisture in cheese. One of the most essential points in determining the quality of a cheese is the amount of moisture it contains. A proper retention of moisture by the product in a cured state depends primarily on the rennet that separated it from the watery serum of milk, and secondly on the amount of heat applied in cooking, and the quantity of salt afterwards added. To adjust all these little niceties to a minimum of fine, even quality, of which moisture is an adjunct, requires experience and long familiarity with the handling and treatment of milk. Butter, moisture, and casein should exist in about equal parts to make a mellow cheese, and to fix the proportion rightly, enough rennet should be incorporated into the milk to expel all excess of moisture, and yet leave enough to withstand the effect of a heat judiciously gauged to cook it. Thus, rennet influences moisture on the start, and other forces afterward are introduced that either aid or retard it. When rennet diffuses itself through milk, its power and potency are largely measured by the temperature of the fluid body surrounding it. As cheese making is merely an imitation of nature's workings in curdling milk in a calf's stomach, the nearer we can follow that process on the start, the closer to perfection we can get. Long experience has demonstrated that a temperature between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit is the best degree of warmth for milk to have attained when it reaches the peptic fluid. A temperature above that expels the butter globules into the whey, and below, the active principle of rennet is not brought out, and tardily and incompletely coagulates the milk solids. By afterward applying the lowest degree of heat that will cook it within a reasonable time to a consistency of contraction and expansion, the moisture still remains in proper proportion. A few degrees of excess heat will produce a dry, hard curd and a future dry, hard cheese. Judgment, discretion, and experience are necessary in applying salt to retain moisture. Salt itself is, of course, a moisture retainer, but a too heavy application hardens and stiffens the cheese structure and retards the curing of the product. Never salt more than enough to give and retain flavor and preserve quality. If the points we have given above have all been observed, then the proper proportion of moisture in cheese will be assured. Prominent English cheese judges have passed verdicts on fine cheese in the following words: "We want cheese rich, solid, fine-flavored, true-colored, that is, of an even color throughout, sound, handsome, that will go on to improve for 12 months or longer if desired." A good cheese is close and firm in texture, yet mellow. In character or quality, it is rich, with a tendency to melt in the mouth. The flavor full and fine, apparently that of a hazelnut. The characteristics of a good cheese are mellow and rich in taste and flavor, and firm and full in texture, solid but not tough. A good cheese is rich without being greasy, with a sweet, nutty flavor, clear and equal color throughout, and of a compact, solid texture without being waxy, firm, and yet melts easily in the mouth, leaving no rough or ill flavor on the palate. The English conception of peerless cheese is ours too, and we must continue to grind away on the road of improvement until we bring the united product to the standard of unimpeachable quality and uniformity. Rule for making out dividends. Many makers are now expected to figure out the milk dividends for the patrons and issue fortnightly statements. A quick, easy rule to follow in doing this business is to first foot up each patron's milk for the number of days' delivery in 1 or 2 sales, as the case may be. Draw a line across the page of the factory account book opposite the date sold up to, and as you add each man's milk, set the amount down opposite his name on the tally slate. After you have summed it all up, go over it again, adding from the top of the columns downward. This will correct any mistakes you may have made. Next, add the separate sums of milk together into one grand total, and using this united sum for a dividend, take the number of pounds of cheese in the sale or sales for a divisor, and the quotient will be the ratio, or the number of pounds of milk it has taken to make a pound of cheese. Then, multiply the number of pounds of cheese by the price per 100 pounds you get for making, and deduct the product from the full cash amount that the cheese has brought. The residue money divide up proportionately among the patrons as follows. Using the grand total of milk for a divisor, see how many times it is contained in the money minus cost of making. The quotient will be the net price of 100 pounds of milk. Multiply each patron's separate amount of milk by this price per 100 pounds, and the product will be the net moneyed income on that sale or sales for the patron. In getting the price of a pound of milk, it is seldom necessary to carry decimally beyond mills. In a measure, the work all proves itself, for if by adding together the face value of each patron's check, the amount does not agree with the cheese returns, less making, your figuring will need a review. It is customary now to send out with each check a statement demonstrating and setting forth just how the factory business is running. Thus, each patron becomes a critic of the secretary. I append a statement properly filled out. Sales Statement, Plainfield, New York, June 20th, 1889. E.W. Wright's Cheese Factory, in account with Mr. John Williams, sold from May 14th to 29th. Number of boxes, 168. Total milk, 69,779 pounds. Total cheese, 7,026 pounds. Price per pound, 3,434 at 8 1/4 cents. 3,592 at 8 1/8 cents. Ratio 9.93. Net price per 100 pounds milk 71.3. Your milk 8,336. Amount less making $59.43. The whey vat. The whey vat may be regarded as a necessary evil, but with means at hand to relieve ourselves of some of its putrefactive characteristics, we trust that the day for having this swill tub harnessed to the factory, will soon be an item of the shady past. Whey is all right in its place, but its place as soon as it is drained from the curd is a long distance from the factory building. I would place the whey vat 10 rods away from the factory, and if night delivery of milk was the rule, I would move it 20 rods off. Get it at least beyond contaminating distance, and then have the whey carried to it in open tin troughs. If the troughs are thoroughly painted, you need not fear rust, and as they are of metal, they cannot dry up, warp, and leak. Have the spouts about the factory perfectly tight, so that no whey can fall to the ground, for it is fearful stuff to generate offensive effluvia. Try and keep the whey receptacle as neat and clean as possible. Have it roofed, but open on the sides. Skim the cream from it every morning, and it would be much better if you would churn it fresh, instead of keeping it for weeks to be rendered out in a kettle by fire. Scrub the vat out every day with a broom. It will take 5 minutes' time and a pailful of hot water. Make it a rule for each patron to draw away no more than 3 pails of whey for every 100 pounds of milk delivered. Also, make it a rule to yard nobody's pigs or calves about the premises for convenient whey slopping. Insist on it that if your patrons insist on drawing sour whey home in their milk cans, they put on extra elbow grease afterward in cleansing them. A cheesemaker hardly likes to make the imputation to patrons that their wives are not neat, only perhaps when they are in a great hurry about scalding out the sour whey from milk cans, and yet such insinuations on his part are often necessary. Whys and wherefores. Curd is first cut with the horizontal knife to facilitate easy expulsion of the whey. Cheese is a good edible because, besides being highly nutritive, the rennet or gastric juice it contains aids digestion and the assimilation of other foods. Whey should never be fed to cows because, having once been secreted in their mammillary glands in the form of milk, it has now taken on the nature of an excrement. Consequently, a resecretion would be highly prejudicial to the quality and healthfulness of the product. It was formerly supposed that febbrine was exclusively a constituent of animal blood, but now the theory that slight traces of it in milk induce rennet coagulation is generally accepted as authentic. If a cheese is misshapen by uneven pressing or otherwise, when taken from the hoop, put it back and press it over again. Remember that appearance goes a long way with dealers. Do not tolerate any cheese in the room that are deformed. Cheesemakers should insist that patrons with large messes of milk set their night's yield in 2 cans. Thoroughly air the fluid by stirring or dipping immediately subsequent to milking, and then dump both portions together in the morning, so as not to mix night's and morning's milk until it is mixed in common in the cheese vat. If this rule is insisted upon and faithfully observed, a great deal of damaged milk will be avoided. A quack doctor should as soon be granted a diploma to practice as an ignorant apprentice at cheesemaking be given the responsibility of the manufacture of a vat of milk. The health of the community is in great danger from both frauds. Cheese that are surface mottled, spread the bandage and show a soft, weak rind, have been insufficiently cooked. The remedy lies in a more upward tendency of the mercury. The art of cheese-making cannot be learned wholly from paper, because variations of milk quality constantly clash with regular modes of procedure. Here the practical experience and sound judgment of the maker must intervene and offset the lacteal variation by appropriate changes in the manner of working the product. Making good cheese out of poor milk is much talked of by makers and considered quite an accomplishment. It consists in clothing the product in a glamour of deception, propagating dyspepsia, and shielding careless dairymen. Skimmed cheese is dry and tasteless and unfit for human food because the meat has been extracted and the shell left. It should take a back seat on the bench of humiliation besides oleomargarine. When whey sparkles, it is sour. When raw curd settles quickly after being cut up, it is a signal that it is aging rapidly and developing acid. White scum on the whey indicates the presence of acid. Butter exuding slightly from the hoops of pressing cheese tells of acid and bespeaks a fine quality of goods. Butter exuding in excessive quantity from the hoops is proof that the milk has either been violently shaken up over rough roads or has been set at a very high temperature. You cannot get a good rind on a poor quality of cheese. You can always have a perfect rind on one of good quality. Thus, in one sense, the rind indicates the quality. Cleanliness is next to godliness about a factory. Because milk being an animal fluid, it is of nitrogenous composition, and the waste that accrues from it on decomposition becomes the most fetid carrion. Buttermilk added to sweet milk in making cheese is a diabolical habit, the object nowadays being not to produce cheese from slop, but from pure wholesome milk alone. Airing curds thoroughly after salting is necessary to expel gaseous odors. The improved quality of the cheese will repay every maker for doing it. Never cease to agitate the question of only 6 days' labor in the week for the cheesemaker. Agitate it because God has laid it down as a commandment for all mankind, and nature inexorably exacts from the physical forces every violation of the rule. Keep the curing room at an even temperature of from 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, because a less amount of heat might sour the green cheese on the shelves, and more warmth might cause them to lose butter to the point of off flavor. Keep the surface of cheese impervious to fly attacks, and you will never be troubled with skippers. Never use sour press cloths on cheese, not only from sense of neatness, but because the rank acid will check the rind. If you are caught with a soft curd on your hands, one that has soured so quickly that you have had no opportunity to give it a firm cook, grind it twice and stir it more than usual. This will reduce pulpy lumps, add stability to the curd, and prevent the cheese from spreading out of shape in the bandage. Rennet is the life and soul of cheese, as much depending on its efficacy as on yeast in bread. Excessive heat stifles and kills out its virtue, and leaves the cheese structure dead and indigestible. Makers should bear this fact in mind, and never allow the cooking curd to rest long on the bottom of the vat. The rennet jar should never be covered, as nothing can be mentioned that is more liable to contract fetid taint than these skins. Exclusion of air from the vessel in which they are soaking is extremely liable to spoil them, in spite of the salt the liquor contains. In weighing patrons' milk at the factory, the scale should be balanced down and up weight taken. To the uninitiated, this might at first seem an injustice, but a little experience will soon show that it is imperatively necessary. The dealers to whom the cheese are consigned exact stiff-up weight, and if the same is not taken at the milk delivery window, woe be to the ratio. As all patrons are served alike in the premises, no loss or injustice accrues to anyone, and the maker is in a position to deal as he is being dealt with. Pulverize salt thoroughly before sprinkling it over the curd. Hard lumps will not dissolve and will produce cauterized spots through the cheese. During the hot weather of summer, remember that curd will stand a third more souring and yet come down into mellow cheese than it would earlier or later in the season. Bearing this fact in mind gives a maker mental relief when he has a curd that has the start of him on acid, and yet afterward comes out all right, perhaps making the best cheese in the room. Saving curd over to mix in with the next day's cheese is not desirable, but it is often unavoidable, as cheese of as even weight as possible are always wanted. Take the curd to be saved over and put it in a bag of bandage cloth. Mix into it an extra handful of salt in order to prevent too much souring, and hang the sack in a cool, dry place. The next day, just prior to drawing the whey, empty the old curd into the vat and stir it up with the new. There are sometimes extreme cases of butter separation from the cooked casein. I have seen where butter would settle in the seams and cavities of cheese, to the almost utter ruination of the product, and the distraction of the maker because he could not discern and stop the cause. There are many causes, some of which are beyond the power of the maker to remedy, such as churning the milk and drawing it to the factory over stony roads, etc. But he can prevent too high heat at setting time, and he can manipulate milk with gentleness before the rennet is added. In consigning cheese to market, always put the consignor's name on the side instead of one cover of the box. Covers are apt to come off in transit and get mixed with those of other consignments, entailing much trouble to those concerned. When coagulated milk has reached the right consistency to cut up, draw the curd knife through it at a moderate speed, truly and unwaveringly. The cutting behind an experienced hand will expel whey clear and green in color. In this item of procedure, let your hand be counted among the experienced. And with those excellent tidbits of advice, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Handbook on Cheese Making. As a confirmed cheese lover, I'm finding this fascinating, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.